Well, welcome to Luke chapter 21. We're going to get into some heavy topics today as Christ is going to say one of the most controversial things that the scribes and Pharisees hated him to say, as well as he is going to talk about his second coming and some of the destructions and challenges and things. So this is kind of similar to the Matthew chapter 24, if you followed along with that as well. So verse 1, and he looked up and saw the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. So remember, if you follow these last couple chapters, Christ is in the temple teaching. The scribes and Pharisees, he cleansed the temple in chapter 19. In chapter 20, the scribes and Pharisees accosted him, asked him some questions to confuse him and trick him in his words, and he marvelously did not fall into any of their traps. So he's still in the temple, and he happens to notice these rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. So there is a place you go, and the money that you're donating to the church, like your temple tax, basically it's kind of a tithing type idea. They're casting it into these bins so that's where they collect the money for the temple tax. Verse 2, and he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. Now, to look at this, we've talked about this a lot in the other Gospels, but mites are like the smallest half-denomination type ideas that there is. They're really, really tiny. So these rich men are throwing in large amounts of money. This poor woman is throwing in a very small, meager amount of money. So dollar amount, the rich are doing way more in their donations and tax than they are for this woman. Like this woman would probably never pay. A rich person is putting in tax into the treasury once, more than she'll do in her entire life. Verse 3, and he said, of a truth I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. Now they're probably looking at this going, she put in 2 mites and that guy put a whole bag of money in there. How can she be putting in more than they all? Dollar amount wise, they put in way more than she ever did. But there's a different way we have to think about this. And that's where verse 4 comes in. For all these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. But she of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. So when we look at verse 4, these people are donating, yes, lots of money, but they're not donating enough money to hurt their living. They're donating of their abundance. They're not so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, I make this much money, I have to live on this much money, so this is somewhere inside this much I'm going to give. So they're not giving till it hurts. They're giving the excess they have. Is giving your excess giving? I mean, are you really giving a lot? Is it really making an effort for you? You know, if you had a sandwich and you saw somebody who was hungry, okay, if you had 2 sandwiches and you gave them 1 sandwich and you ate the other sandwich, have you really, yes, you gave them, but have you really made a huge sacrifice? Versus if you had 1 sandwich and you cut it in half to give them some and then you had some. Hopefully that kind of gives you this idea to think about. They're giving their abundance. They're not giving anything that is literally having them to sacrifice their way of life. What this woman did, this poor woman, she gave in pretty much all the money she had to the treasury. She has no money, basically. That would be a different thing. So percentage-wise, she is blowing these rich people out of the water as far as how much she's giving percentage-wise. They're giving small percentages that are pretty inconsequential. She's giving all of it to the temple because she wants the blessings of God more than she wants money in her life. So think about that. Do we spend time in our life focusing on money more than the things of God? How much of your life is dependent upon your wealth, and how much of your life is dependent upon God blessing you to get through? That's a good question to ask. This is just my opinion and perspective, but I believe too many people spend too much time striving for money to live and to survive, and not enough striving to have God bless them in their life. It's not, it doesn't mean you can't have money if you pursue God in your life. What it means is, how am I treating my priorities in life? Do I prioritize the things of God, or do I prioritize the things of money? If it comes down to it, if my bills are going to be struggling to get paid, do I go work on the Sabbath, or do I focus on worshiping on the Sabbath? It's an interesting idea. In fact, in season 1 of The Chosen, we see Peter facing this. He's got this huge tax bill to pay to the Romans, and he can't pay it. And so he goes fishing on Shabbat when he should be worshiping, because he sees in his mind, I got to pay the tax. God, it's not gonna hurt God if I miss Shabbat once. And so he goes to fish. So that's sometimes we make those decisions in our mind. Do we sometimes prioritize the things of this world over things of God? Oh, I can't take an extra day off work, so I'm going to use my Sunday to travel home instead of worship. I'm not going to come home a day early so that I can be home to worship, or I'm not going to take the time to worship while I'm on vacation. I'm going to use that day as my extra day. I need extra work done, so I'm going to work more or play more during the weekend and then use my Sunday to mow my lawn. So do you see these ideas? And I'm not trying to say where that line is on keeping the Sabbath day holy. What I'm saying is, oftentimes we will prioritize, I should say, the things of the world over the things of God. When those clash, and I can guarantee you they will clash often in your life, that's on purpose. It's to test you to see if you're really willing to keep the things of God. Oh, I have this amazing hunt I can go do, or I have this amazing vacation I can go do, or I have these other things to do, or I could do the things of God. Is it more important to be with my family and raise my family and read our scriptures together, or is it more important that we go watch movies and entertainment, or I work extra hours to pay for my lifestyle, for my family? Those are some of the questions that come up in our daily life that we have to think about. And it's something that you and God have to work out. Okay. I'm not trying to judge anybody on those. You and God have to figure that out. You guys got to do that. That's up to you to decide. Okay. So that's this parable of the widow's mite, basically. Right there is, percentage wise, she gave all to God to live on his blessings. What would you have to give to get to that point in your life? To be like, hey, God, I'm giving up so much stuff. I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet for my life, my living. You need to help me do this. What would you have to give to get to that point in your life? And would it be worth it to get to that point? That would be a true test of faith, that's for sure, to get to that point. So verse 5, now we get another story here. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. So these are people that are going, this is amazing temple. The architecture is amazing. It's such a beautiful temple. They've done so well, and it's built so well, and amazing temple. He said, verse 6, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come. So this is Christ responding to these people who are admiring the temple. The days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. That was 70 AD. They destroyed the temple, and they burned it down first, because of the people were hiding in it. That was the last hideout of the Jews, was in the temple. And so the Romans were like breaking the windows and throwing torches in to just burn everybody out. And they destroyed the temple and then crippled it. It fell to the ground. They pushed them all over, absolutely destroyed it. Never been rebuilt since. Verse 7, and they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? So the idea that the temple will be destroyed is not without historical merit, because the Babylonians did it hundreds of years earlier. But this was somewhat seen as a blasphemous idea, to talk about the temple being destroyed. You just don't talk about that kind of stuff. So this is the thing that really riles the Pharisees and Sadducees up, that this temple will be destroyed and he will build it again. It's like, wait, what? That sounds blasphemous. So they don't like Jesus because of that. So now they're asking here in verse 7 again, when shall this happen? That's amazing. That's kind of shocking to hear that the temple is going to be destroyed. But when is this going to happen? Verse 7, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So they're wanting to know, when is all this going to happen, basically. Verse 8, and he said, take heed that ye be not deceived. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. So he's warning them that there's going to be people that come, so that this idea of destroying the temple is not just literal, but metaphorical too, that the gospel will be destroyed. People will come to destroy the gospel. And so he's warning them here about these people. People are going to come saying, I am Christ. They're going to say, I have that authority from Christ. You need to follow me. And he's saying, don't follow them, basically. Now we're going to see this. There's the Ebionites, the Marcionites, lots of other groups start to happen after the destruction of 70 AD. A lot of challenges happen as Christianity starts to grow. It really splinters off quickly. We'll see a little bit of this in Paul's writings, in fact. Now verse 9, but when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified. For these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. So he's saying you're going to hear of wars and commotions of wars. Okay? 66 AD, 70 AD, lots of other things are happening. Disruptions in the Roman Empire. Yeah. The time of peace that Claudius brought in is about to end, basically. Claudius was the emperor. Remember, we talked about in the beginning of Matthew that he kind of ruled over some of the most peaceful times in the Roman Empire. That's all about to go away, and it's about to get more crazy in the Roman Empire. Verse 10, then said he unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. But before all these, they shall lay their hands on you, and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before the kings and rulers for my name's sake. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. So this is, he's prophesying all these things that are going to be happening, basically. Persecutions, lots of stuff happening. Okay, in verse 12, he says, deliver you to the synagogues, that's religious persecution. Deliver you to the prison, that's the government, so Roman persecution. So Jewish persecution, because a synagogue is a Jewish religious location, and governmental persecution into prison against these disciples. So he says all this crazy stuff's going to happen, but before all that happens, you're going to be persecuted and killed. That's going to happen too. Now, here's one thing that's interesting about this idea of latter-day prophecy, and we see this in scholarly writings in Isaiah and Jeremiah and others. In the scholarly world, they do not believe in revelation necessarily. They do not believe that someone will predict the future. Because if God can tell someone to predict the future, then it's hard to objectively study somebody. So in a lot of scholarly circles, they say that doesn't happen. We're gonna pull that option out, and now we have to think about how did they know all this was going to happen. So, like in this story of Isaiah, that's why we in scholarly world, we talk a lot about this in our videos on Isaiah. They think of the first 55 chapters, 50 to 55 chapters as Isaiah 1, and then Isaiah 2 as a second book that was added, which is all this otherworldly destructions and predictions and things. And they say, well, if revelation doesn't happen, then somebody at the time or after the destruction wrote about it and then included it in Isaiah's writings to make it sound like he said it. If you believe in revelation, then you don't need to worry about that. Someone can say it and then it happens later. So a lot of times scholars try to look at the scriptures as saying this isn't a fulfillment of last days prophecy. So there are a lot of scholars that would look at Luke 21 as well as Matthew 24 and say This was not prophecy of, the year 2050 or 2030 or whatever. It's not there. It's not latter day prophecy in our day and age. This is prophecy for their day and age only. They forget that sometimes things can symbolically happen and then literally happen and then symbolically happen later as well. Prophecies can be true more than once, as we see with Jeremiah and Isaiah and those guys. So that's part of the challenge in interpreting what we see here in Luke 21 as well as Matthew 24, is some people say this happened in their day and age. And it did. It absolutely did. Okay. If we look at the history in that time, we can see these ideas again, 66 AD. So remember, this is around 33-ish AD. So about 30 years later, Rome and Israel are going to go at it in a battle. Israel's going to win, push the Roman legions out, and they're going to claim that God has given them the victory and believe that God is on their side, which emboldens them to be a little more radical with Rome. And then in 70 A.D., the emperor dies, a new emperor gets appointed, and the new emperor's son, Titus, he is going to then be sent to deal with the Jewish uprising. And Titus is going to come through and just abjectly destroy the place. That's the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem, which they never recovered from, basically. At least not until they became a nation recognized by the United Nations around 1949, I believe. I could be wrong. If I am, put it in the comments and correct me on that one. So at that same time, okay, we have to realize this, that there's other things that are happening at the same time. Okay, if I remember correct, Pompeii, okay, we've heard the famous stories of Mount Vesuvius burying Pompeii in a massive volcanic eruption and things. That was 68 AD. That was around this same time frame. So we talk about a great earthquake shall be in diverse places. There was massive earthquakes because of the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. There's other explanations of these ideas as well, not to mention then the famines and pestilences and plagues because of the amount of ash and dust in the air absorbs the rain. It doesn't rain for a while. It changes the climate. Lots of things happened at the time. So we can see all of this happening in their day and age back then in the first century, towards the end of the first century, getting into the second century. It doesn't mean that it can't be, again, a prophecy fulfilled in our day and age as well. As this is the things to look forward to. Of the world's going to be in tumultuousness. It's going to be a problem, a lot of chaos and challenges that are going to be there for our future as well, just before the second coming comes. So that is possible. Okay. Now let's move on here with this. Verse 14. So this is the Christ giving some admonition to his disciples. Settle it therefore in your hearts. Do not meditate before what ye shall answer. So he says, just hold on to this. Don't think ahead. Don't premeditate this. Just don't worry. Don't overthink this, basically. Just accept this, put it in your heart, and let it percolate, but don't try to overthink all this. Verse 15, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist. So just as Christ was able to resist his people trying to ask him these questions to trap him, and he got out of it, those who follow Christ, when they get accused and persecuted, he will bless them with the guidance and the wisdom to get out of those traps and to see through those things as well. Verse 16, and ye shall be betrayed both by parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends, and some of you shall they cause to be put to death. Ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. So lots of persecution on his apostles, basically. But there, verse 18, there shall not an hair of your head perish. So don't worry. I've got you. We'll get you taken care of, basically. Now, verse 19, in your patience possess ye your souls. Now, that sounds weird. Like, why in my patience possess my soul? What? Another translation of the Greek text is, in your patience you win mastery of your souls. Patience means to abide in faith, knowing that sometimes it is in the waiting rather than in the receiving that we grow the most. This was true in the time of the Savior, and it is true in our times as well. So realize, sometimes waiting to be blessed or waiting to be healed is where we find Christ the most and find the opportunities of growth for our life, is in the waiting, the patience. Have patience. We're in a world that doesn't have much patience. We need to have more patience. So patiently deal with the afflictions is the way that they probably took this back then. Verse 20, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So this again is getting to the idea of that the destruction of Jerusalem. He talked about in the last chapter, in Luke 19, or not last chapter, 2 chapters ago. Sorry. This desolation, the abomination of desolations that Daniel talked about, the destruction of Jerusalem. So verse 21, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries thereinto. So this is fleeing. This is getting out of here. Zechariah talks about this too in his books in the Old Testament. The idea of when the rumors of wars, the destruction start to happen, it's time to flee. So this is interesting when you look at the idea of the destruction of Jerusalem, because the Jews didn't leave. In fact, the destruction of Jerusalem happens around Passover, and so there's a huge amount of Jews coming into the city for the migration to do Passover in Jerusalem, kind of a pilgrimage. So the city of Jerusalem like quadruples in population, which is why they collapse. They don't have enough food supplies to take care of people because there's so many people, they can't sustain it, and they fall and they end up in cannibalism and other things just before Titus comes in with his armies and destroys them in 70 AD. So this is, again, the Jews aren't necessarily listening for this as much as the Christians, the followers of Christ. So they learn that when we start to hear that the war armies are coming, it's time to get out of town. It's time to flee to the mountains. So when Titus comes down in 70 AD to destroy him, he realizes that one of the problems they had last time is they did a direct frontal assault on Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was getting supplied with resources and men from the outlying areas. So he did things differently. He went to all the outlying areas first. He'd basically surround a town, walk into town and say, if you are Jewish, you either instantly declare allegiance to Rome or you're going to be murdered right now. You're going to be executed. Round them all up, execute them all. So the Christians realized this, that the Christians knew because of Christ's teachings, crazy stuff is going to be happening. When they started to see this happen, a lot of the Christians fled those cities and got out of the area. So the Christians survived better through this time than the Jews did because of these forewarnings of Christ during that time. And so that's what he's saying here. Now, we can see this in latter-day prophecy of when, these great world armies are coming against Jerusalem in the last days. We see that they need to flee because they're losing the battle. The Jews lose, and these armies start to come into the city and take it over. And so the Jews flee out the back of the city and head to the mountains, and that's when the earthquake and it opens up and they meet Christ and they flee, and then Christ takes out the armies for the latter days type ideas. So it's a similar pattern to what we're seeing here. But again, it didn't happen. The Jews couldn't flee. The Christians got to the mountains, but the Jews couldn't. They didn't see it coming. Verse 22, for these be the days of vengeance, and all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck. So this is a warning for women, if you think about it. Pay attention, ladies. This is not a time to have a family. Woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. So you think it's going to be hard to get out, it's going to be hard to get out by yourself, but if you've got a baby in tow or you're pregnant, it's going to be worse. It's going to be even harder for you to get out. So it's going to be a rough time, basically. Pregnancy and dealing with kids is tough by themselves in good times, but trying to do this in bad times is way harder, way worse. So it's going to be crazy times. Verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. So this is a scattering. They're going to be held captive and then scattered. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, here's something that's interesting about this verse, okay? This verse in Luke gives us another phrase that we haven't heard in the other Gospels. The times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So what he's saying in here is the Jews are going to have these armies come against them. They're going to be destroyed, okay? Those at Jerusalem will be destroyed, okay? Those who have fled, which are the Christians paying attention to Christ's teachings, are going to flee and get out for safety. The Jews are going to be destroyed. Then they're going to be spread among the nations. Now, we saw this through the Assyrian Empire conquest, but now Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And then the Jews are just going to be in exile. They're going to wander and go all over the place in history because they have no nation anymore. They can't rebuild themselves anymore. And they're going to be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So there's coming a point, there's a timing to this. Okay, we've talked about this in past videos. When we think of latter-day prophecy, there's two types of prophecy. There's snapshots, then there's direction. Snapshots are telling you what's going to happen. Direction tells you when it's going to happen. The problem is they rarely ever talk about these at the same time. So they give us timing without telling us what's going to happen. And they tell us what's going to happen without telling us when it's going to happen. That's part of the conundrum of dealing with latter-day prophecy. If you're trying to figure out the last days with these latter-day prophecy ideas, we don't know how they all line up. And that's the challenge we have. So now we're getting timing. There is a time of the Gentiles. There's a time when the Gentiles will be ruling and doing things, and during that time the Gentiles are ruling. So we think about this from the Jewish standpoint. This is Rome and their area. So this is up into Europe area basically, and the descendants of Rome, Roman people, are Gentiles in a way. You know, the non-Jewish groups are going to win and persecute the Jews for a long time. There will come a point, according to this verse, this is unique, we get in Luke, is because of the times of the Gentiles, so there is this period of time where it is called the times of the Gentiles. At some point it will be fulfilled, and then things are going to change. The Jews won't be as persecuted as much after that time. In fact, verse 25, he goes on and says, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." So it's going to be a wild time. Now, this is really interesting too, because while we've talked a little bit in the New Testament videos about the influence of the book of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, we hear of a story of Enoch understanding the tumultuousness of the times of his day and age. The nature is getting more violent. As the people get more wicked, nature gets more violent. And in the book of Enoch, he has a vision where he sees the intelligence of earth, what we would call like Mother Nature or Mother Earth, is pleading with God to get rid of the wickedness, because the elements on the earth are responding to the wickedness of the people. So the more wicked the people get, the more the elements get crazier. And he sees this in vision. And so this is kind of this idea, a conceptual idea to the book of Enoch we're getting here in verse 25. The more wicked the people get, the more the climate gets wild. So this is a whole nother way to think about climate change. Is the climate changing because of humans? Yes. Maybe it's not our carbon emissions, but our spiritual wickedness. That's the problem. That's another way to think about that based upon what we're seeing here. So verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. People are going to be afraid. It's going to be a crazy time. They're going to even feel like physics is shifting. There's like, things are changing. Things are like monumental stuff is happening here. It's crazy what's happening. And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now that did not happen in Jesus' time, so we can say that this is more talking about our day, our future, basically, is what we're looking at. Now, in these verses, Joseph Smith adds a little bit more in his translation. He says, "Now these things he spake unto them concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. And then his disciples asked him, saying, Master, tell us concerning thy coming. And he answered them and said, In the generation in which the times of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled, there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, like the sea and the waves roaring. The earth also shall be troubled, and the waters of the great deep." Then going into verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. So this is more last days, not so much Jesus's day, basically. Okay, so this is our future that he's talking about, the destructions, the challenges. It's going to get so crazy that things are going to be just, even we'll feel like the very elements are being, the as it says, the powers of heaven shall be shaken. The powers of heaven are what control the earth, physics, ideas. So we're going to feel like even our concept of understanding science is going to be, we're going to question things like, wait a minute, that shouldn't have happened. Holy cow, crazy stuff is going on. And then in verse 27, you shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. So Christ is on his way. When all this tumultuousness is happening, I think we're still at the very beginning of all this. Personally, I think we've got a long ways to go to get to this destructive point. Granted, a lot of it can happen in a really short period of time, but I don't think we're quite there yet. So a question is how do we know when the times of the fulfilling of the Gentiles is up? That's an important point, and we don't get that in the New Testament. So let's see, verse 29, and he spake to them a parable. So now here's a parable about all this going on. Behold the fig tree and all the trees, when they now shoot forth, yet ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Now, I like this. This parable is an important one to help us understand last days prophecy. In the last days, we know all this destruction and craziness is going to happen. But when is it going to happen? We look for natural signs, like a season change. And that's what he's talking about here. When you see a fig tree and they now shoot forth, you start to see the leaves start to come out, the buds start coming out. They don't happen at random times of the year. It doesn't just, trees don't suddenly bud in the middle of summer. They don't suddenly bud in the middle of winter. They bud in the proper timing, the season change, okay, when spring happens. So what he's saying is look for the season change. Now, seasons, we can put on a calendar, here's the official day of spring. But we can also have snowstorms and cold still happening at that same time. Winter can still be there. So the end of winter and the beginning of spring doesn't happen on the calendar year. It can shift. Changes in weather can shift that. Sometimes we get early spring, sometimes we get a later spring and a longer winter. It varies. The question isn't the timing of it. The question is watching the pattern to know when it's going to happen. So if you think of people who claim they know how to time the end of the world, even Christ tells us, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the timing. Watch the pattern, not the timing, because you're going to get the timing wrong. So that's an important thing to always think about. Now, verse 32, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Now that has caused a lot of people consternation, a lot of problems with that one, because they're going, wait a minute, did Jesus just say that the people of his day will still be alive when all this is fulfilled? That is a justification that would say that all this only happened in his day and age. But yet, if we look at it, who saw Christ come in his glory in a cloud? Nobody did. That didn't happen back then. So does that then mean that if this is still our future, that there are people that are going to live 2,000 some odd years? Or does this mean that Christ misspoke? And if he misspoke, what else did he misspeak? Does that break your shelf? Do you see how this verse 34 or 32, excuse me, gives us some challenges with this? Joseph Smith actually tries to work on this verse in his translation. He says, "This generation, the generation when the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, shall not pass away till all be fulfilled." So he adds in there that it's not literally the generation that Christ is living in, but the generation of the people that will be alive when the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So that changes a little bit. At least that makes it a little bit more understandable, not quite as, these weird ideas of how does this fit? It doesn't seem to fit. This is a round peg and this is a square peg and a round hole type idea. And so maybe there's more in other translations or ideas. Maybe verse 32 was mistranslated by scribes or changed or adjusted. We don't know. We don't have any indication that of that at this point. But it is just a hard one to fulfill. Now, also though, he says this generation shall not pass away. So he's not talking about a person, but a group of people. So what Joseph Smith puts in makes it sound a lot more plausible. That it's not Jesus' generation, but the generation of the people, when the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled, they will be alive and see the fulfilling of all this. Verse 33, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. That's important. Heaven and earth, mortality, mortal world will go away, but Christ's words have a spiritual power to them that means they will exist outside of the mortal realm. They will exist without mortality, without this physical world. Basically, there's some spiritual power to what he's saying. Verse 34 now, okay, this is the next story. And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, so that day come upon you unawares. And if you look at this idea, surfeiting is in the Greek debauchery. So what they're talking about is riot and reveling. So he says, be careful, because you're going to have this tendency to think it's taking too long for Christ to come. Maybe he's not going to come. If he's not going to come, then I'm not going to be held accountable for my sins, which means there is no sins if there's no accountability. So I'm going to go do whatever I want to get into riotous living. Just live it up. Live this mortal experience up, because none of it exists. None of the spiritual stuff exists because he's not coming. So that's putting this whole idea of focusing on mortality and not thinking about the next life, basically. And that's going to be a trap that people will fall into. They're going to think that Christ isn't coming. And so they're going to say, well, if he's not coming, I'm going to do whatever I want. Verse 35, for as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. So everybody's going to deal with this idea that maybe it's not true, and so I'm going to do whatever I want. Verse 36, watch ye therefore and pray always, that ye may be counted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Now realize, when he says in here, this is important, okay? He's telling us how to escape the problems and challenges. He doesn't mean it's going to be easy. He says, here's how to not be affected by all this. So if you don't want to be caught in that snare, if you don't want to deal with these destructions, then what do? Watch, for one, be ready for the coming of the Christ. Pray always. So keep in direct, constant communication with God, and he will guide you and help you. Okay? So you'll be accounted worthy to escape the destructions. Joseph Smith actually adds in here a little bit more. He says, and keep my commandments, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape. And the Son of Man, when he shall come clothed in the glory of his Father, you should be able to stand, basically, when he comes the second time. So, in fact, I have a quote here, but this is the New Testament Study Guide. Many of the Savior's teachings about the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming found in Luke 21 are also found in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and the Joseph Smith Matthew. However, only Luke recorded the Savior's warning that if people were overcharged or weighed down with indulgence of appetites, and drunkenness and cares of this life, they would not be prepared for his second coming. This warning is about self-indulgence, and drunkenness in the last days is similar to the Savior's declaration that the last days would be as the days of Noah, when the people were eating and drinking and knew not until the flood came. So this is the idea again. If you're not being prepared for it, you're not going to be ready when it happens. Sometimes people think, "Oh, I can wait till the end, and then as soon as the signs start happening, then I'll repent." Nope. By the time you see the signs, it's too late. So you've got to be prepared and vigilant with that preparedness. That's important for us to look at, okay? That'll help us out to survive these challenges and deal with these things. Now verse 37, and in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to him in the temple for to hear him. So during the day he hangs out in the temple. At night he goes over to the Mount of Olives to do things, is what they're saying basically. That's going to be important. Mount of Olives is an important place for him to be. And we're going to see that more as we get going in. So let's continue into the next chapter. We'll see you then.